The air inside L'Hotel Filante was different from the outside world. It was thicker, heavier with the scent of expensive perfume, fresh-cut lilac, and the faint, mouth-watering aroma of garlic and butter drifting from the kitchen. The lighting was a soft, golden glow that made the crystal glasses sparkle and the polished silverware gleam. Every table was draped in a pristine white cloth, so clean it seemed to absorb the light. This was a world of hushed voices and clinking cutlery, a place where people came to see and be seen, and the young waiter was a master of this world. He moved with a quiet confidence, his back straight, his steps silent on the thick carpet. He wasn't just a server. He was a conductor of a perfect evening. He knew the menu by heart, not just the ingredients, but the stories behind them. He could recommend a wine to pair with the sea bass that would make a businessman feel like a king. He lived for the subtle nod of approval, the quiet thank you that meant he had done his job well. For him, every customer was a puzzle, and his job was to solve them. He read them like books, the weight of a watch on a wrist, the cut of a suit, the sparkle of a diamond necklace. These were the signs that told him how much attention to give, how much flattery to pour on, and how big a tip he could expect. He had a couple at table 3, a man in a tailored suit and a woman in a silk dress. They were easy. He'd already complimented her bracelet and recommended the most expensive bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon, and they were eating it up. He could almost feel the $100 bill in his pocket already. This was his art, and he was a virtuoso. His rhythm was broken by a soft touch on his arm. It was the hostess, a young woman with a tight, professional smile. "Table 7 is yours," she whispered, a hint of apology in her voice. "Walk in." The waiter felt a flicker of irritation. Table 7 was one of his best, a quiet corner booth with a perfect view of the entire room. It was reserved for VIPs and big spenders, not last-minute walk-ins. He gave a curt nod and turned his gaze toward the booth. And then he saw him. The irritation inside him curdled into a hot, sour dislike. Seated in the plush velvet booth was a man who looked like he had taken a wrong turn and ended up in another dimension. He was wearing a simple, dark t-shirt that looked soft from being washed 100 times, and a pair of faded blue jeans with a small, frayed hole near one knee. Draped over the back of the booth was a worn leather jacket, the kind that gets better with age but looks out of place in a room where everyone else's jacket cost more than a month's rent. The man's hair was a bit messy, not in a styled way, but in a way that suggested he'd run his hands through it 100 times out of habit or exhaustion. He wasn't looking at his phone or a menu. He was just looking around the room, his eyes slowly taking in the scene, a look of quiet observation on his face. The waiter's mind raced, a torrent of judgments and calculations. This wasn't a VIP, this was a problem. This man would probably order a glass of water and the cheapest appetizer, take up the prime table for 2 hours and leave a $5 tip. He would bring down the tone of the room. What if one of his real VIP clients, the ones who drop thousands without a second thought, saw this? They might think the restaurant was slipping. He felt a personal sense of offense, as if the man had deliberately shown up looking like this just to ruin his night. He took a deep breath, forcing the professional smile back onto his face. It was a mask he had perfected, a shield that hid his true feelings. He had a job to do no matter how much he disliked the customer. He grabbed a heavy, leather-bound menu from his station, the weight of it feeling like a gavel in his hand. He walked toward table 7, his footsteps measured, his posture perfect. With every step, he reinforced his wall of professionalism, reminding himself that he was better than this, that this was just a temporary inconvenience. He was an actor playing a role, and the role was of the perfect, deferential waiter. He arrived at the table and placed the menu down with a soft but definitive thud. The man, who had been watching the room, slowly turned his attention to the waiter. His eyes were a deep brown, and they held a surprising weariness, a kind of profound tiredness that went beyond a simple lack of sleep. For a brief moment, the waiter felt a strange pang of something, a flicker of curiosity, but he quickly stamped it out. This was not a person to be curious about. This was a person to be managed. "Good evening," the waiter said, his voice smooth and polished, but with an edge of ice underneath it. He didn't introduce himself by name, a small, deliberate slight he reserved for customers he deemed unworthy. "Can I get you started with something to drink?" He made no mention of the signature cocktails, the aged whiskeys, or the extensive wine list. He was already steering the man toward the cheapest options. The man looked at him, and a small, gentle smile touched his lips. "Just water, please." "Thank you." His voice was quiet, a little rough, but polite. The waiter's internal assessment was confirmed. Water, of course. He gave a short, sharp nod. "Certainly," he said, his tone clipped. He turned and walked away, feeling a small, petty sense of victory. He had made his position clear without saying a single rude word. He had put the man in his place. He decided then and there that he would give this table the bare minimum of his attention. He would be polite but distant. He would make the man feel just enough of an outsider that he would eat his simple meal and leave, freeing up the booth for someone who belonged. As he went to fetch the water, he glanced back at the table. The man had opened the menu and was studying it with a serious, focused expression, as if he were reading an important document. The waiter scoffed under his breath. It was just a menu. He couldn't understand why someone who looked so out of place would bother trying to fit in. In his world, you either belonged or you didn't. And this man, he was sure, didn't. He returned to the table with a crystal glass filled with ice and a chilled bottle of mineral water, placing them down with a quiet, deliberate precision that was meant to convey a lack of hurry. The man looked up from the menu, his eyes meeting the waiter's for a second. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft. The waiter gave a stiff nod and turned to leave, eager to get back to his tables that mattered, the ones where the conversation sparkled as much as the wine. But he only took a single step before the man's voice stopped him again. "Excuse me." The waiter paused, his back to the table, and took a slow, silent breath. He pasted the professional smile back on his face before turning around. "Yes, sir?" The man was pointing to a line on the menu with a slightly chipped fingernail. "This says the mushroom risotto is made with a wild medley. I was just wondering what kind of mushrooms are in it. Is there anything particularly unusual?" The question was simple, genuine, but to the waiter it was another sign. This man wasn't used to this kind of food. He was probably used to mushrooms from a can, sliced and put on a pizza. The thought brought a fresh wave of condescension. He resisted the urge to roll his eyes, but just barely. "It's a foraged blend, sir," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any enthusiasm. "Chanterelles, morels, porcini? Depending on the season and what the chef finds." He said it quickly, like he was reciting a dry fact from a textbook, hoping the sheer number of unfamiliar words would shut the man down. It didn't. "Oh, that sounds wonderful," the man replied, a genuine interest in his eyes. "And the steak? It says it's locally sourced. Do you happen to know from the farm?" The waiter felt a muscle in his jaw twitch. This was absurd. It was like talking to a food critic who had lost his way and ended up in a thrift store. He didn't have time for this. He could feel the eyes of the couple at table 3 on him, their wine glasses nearly empty. They were a $20 corkage fee waiting to happen, and he was stuck here playing 20 questions with a man who probably thought locally sourced meant it came from the grocery store down the street. "It's from a farm in the valley, sir. They supply all our beef. It's excellent." His answer was short, clipped, a clear signal to end the conversation. He was about to turn away again when the man closed the menu and set it on the table with a soft, final sound. "Okay," he said, looking up at the waiter. "I think I'm ready." The waiter pulled his order pad from his apron, his pen poised. He was ready for the man to order the cheapest appetizer and ask for more water. "I'll have the mushroom risotto," the man said. "And to start, maybe the burrata with the prosciutto." "That sounds nice." The waiter was slightly taken aback. The burrata was one of the pricier appetizers. Still, it was just one appetizer and one main course. Hardly a big ticket. He scribbled it down without a word. "And for your wine, sir? Would you like to see the list?" The man shook his head. "No, thank you. Just the water is fine for me." There it was. The confirmation. The waiter felt a grim sense of satisfaction. He had been right all along. This man would order a decent meal, nothing too extravagant, and sip his water for 2 hours, taking up valuable real estate in the restaurant. He was a pretender, trying to act like he belonged by ordering a fancy appetizer but then reverting to type by refusing a proper drink. It was an insult to the entire establishment, to the chef, to the very concept of fine dining. As the waiter tore the order sheet from his pad, a new, bold idea began to form in his mind. He was tired of being subtle. This man needed to be put in his place, not for the waiter's own satisfaction, but for the good of the restaurant. He needed to understand that this was a special place, a place for people who appreciated it, not a museum for him to wander through on a whim. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was just loud enough for the man to hear clearly over the gentle hum of the dining room. He put a hand on the back of the empty chair opposite the man, a gesture of false intimacy. "Sir," he began, his tone dripping with a syrupy, insincere concern, "with all due respect, I feel it's my duty to inform you that the prices here are quite substantial. This isn't the sort of establishment one typically visits for a simple, quiet meal alone. The experience, the ingredients, the service, it's all designed for a certain kind of occasion." He paused, letting the words sink in, watching the man's face for a reaction. The man just looked at him, his expression unreadable. The gentle curiosity in his eyes had been replaced by a still, quiet calm. It was unnerving. Emboldened, the waiter delivered the final blow. "Perhaps the cafe on the corner would be more appropriate for your budget. They have a lovely soup and sandwich special, I'm told." He straightened up, a cold, triumphant feeling washing over him. He had done it. He had said what everyone else in the room was probably thinking. He had protected the sanctity of his world. He waited for the man to be angry, to be embarrassed, to gather his worn jacket and storm out. But the man didn't do any of those things. He just sat there, in the plush velvet booth, looking up at the waiter with those deep, tired eyes. He didn't say a word. The silence that stretched between them was heavier and more uncomfortable than any shouted argument could have been. The waiter's triumphant feeling began to curdle, turning into a strange, hollow feeling in the pit of his stomach. He had won the exchange, but as he stood there, under the man's steady, unnerving gaze, he had never felt smaller in his life. The silence that followed his words was a physical thing. It was heavy and thick, pressing in on the waiter from all sides. The gentle clinking of silverware and the low murmur of conversation from the other tables seemed to fade into a distant hum, leaving just the two of them in a bubble of suffocating quiet. He stood there, his hand still on the back of the empty chair, his chest puffed out with a confidence that was already starting to feel a little brittle. He had expected a reaction. He had prepared for anger, for indignation, for a stammered apology and a hasty retreat. But the man just sat there, looking up at him with those deep, unfathomable eyes. There was no anger in them. There was no shame. There was just a stillness, a calm that was far more unsettling than any outburst could have been. It was the quiet of a deep lake, and the waiter felt like he had just thrown a stone into it, only to realize it was much, much deeper than he'd thought. A trickle of unease began to mix with his triumph. He had won, hadn't he? He had made his point. So why did he feel like he was the one being judged? Just as the silence was about to become unbearable, a new sound cut through the air. It was the sharp, frantic swing of the kitchen's double doors. The waiter turned his head, annoyed at the interruption. He saw the restaurant's manager, a woman known for her unshakable calm and razor-sharp professionalism, moving toward his table with a speed and urgency he had never seen before. Her usual composed walk was replaced by a hurried, almost panicked stride. Her eyes, which normally scanned the room with a cool, assessing gaze, were wide and fixed solely on the man in the worn jacket. She completely bypassed the other tables, ignoring a raised hand from a customer who wanted another drink. She was a missile locked on its target, and that target was the waiter's problem customer. The waiter felt a flicker of confusion. What was going on? Was this man someone important after all? A food critic, perhaps? The thought sent a jolt of pure ice through his veins. The manager arrived at the table, slightly out of breath. She didn't even glance at the waiter. It was as if he had become invisible, a piece of furniture. She leaned over the table, her hands clasped together in a gesture of profound apology. "Mr. Reeves," she said, her voice a low, urgent whisper that was filled with a respect so thick it was almost tangible. "I am so sorry. There has been a terrible mix-up." The name hit the waiter like a physical blow. Reeves, it echoed in the sudden emptiness of his mind. Mr. Reeves, the man in the t-shirt, the man with the frayed jeans, the man he had just insulted. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the soft golden lighting of the room swirling into a dizzying blur. He felt the blood drain from his face, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He knew that name. Everyone knew that name. And suddenly it all made terrible, horrifying sense. The tired eyes, the simple clothes, the lack of an entourage, the quiet, observant nature. It wasn't the demeanor of a man who couldn't afford a fancy meal. It was the demeanor of a man who was famous enough to not need to prove anything to anyone. The manager was still talking, her words a torrent of information that washed over the stunned waiter. "We have the private dining room prepared for you and your party, just as you requested. It's all set up. The chef is ready. We were told you were running a few minutes late. We didn't realize you were already here. I am so terribly sorry for this oversight." A party. A private dining room. The waiter's mind reeled, connecting the dots with sickening speed. This wasn't just a famous actor having a quiet dinner alone. This was a planned event. And he had just treated the guest of honor like a vagrant. He could feel the eyes of the nearby tables on them now. The low hum of conversation had died down, replaced by a tense, curious silence. People were noticing. They were whispering. He saw a woman at a nearby table discreetly angle her phone under the table, no doubt recording the scene. His shame was no longer private. It was becoming a public spectacle. The man, Mr. Reeves, finally moved. He gave the manager a small, reassuring nod, a gentle smile gracing his lips. It was the same kind smile he had given the waiter earlier, but now it felt like a gift of immeasurable grace. "It's all right," he said, his voice quiet but firm, cutting through the manager's panicked apologies. "No harm done." He then slowly turned his head and looked at the waiter. The waiter felt his heart stop. He braced himself for the anger, the public humiliation he so richly deserved. But it never came. There was still no anger in those famous eyes. There was just a deep, profound sadness that seemed to pierce right through the waiter's soul. It was a look that said, "I see you, and I'm disappointed." That was it. That was all it took. The waiter would have preferred a shouting match, a thrown drink, anything but this quiet, pitying gaze. It stripped away every layer of his arrogance, every defense he had ever built, leaving him feeling raw and exposed. Mr. Reeves then turned back to the manager. "The service was fine," he said, a simple lie that was somehow more cutting than any truth could be. He was letting the waiter off the hook, not for the waiter's sake, but because it was his nature. He was protecting the very person who had just tried to humiliate him. He pushed his chair back and stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He was a good head taller than the waiter, and for the first time, the waiter felt physically small. As he stood, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple leather wallet. He took out a $100 bill and placed it on the table, right next to the untouched water glass. "For your trouble," he murmured, his eyes meeting the waiter's one last time. Then he turned and followed the manager toward a discreet door at the back of the restaurant. Disappearing from view, the waiter stood frozen, staring at the money on the table. It wasn't a tip. It was a testament, a monument to his own foolishness and the other man's incredible kindness. The $100 felt like an accusation, a brand on his skin. The manager paused at the door and looked back at him, her expression a mixture of pity and cold fury. She didn't say a word. She just shook her head slightly, a gesture that was more final and damning than any termination speech could ever be. The waiter was left alone in the middle of the dining room, a statue of shame, the whispers of the other patrons washing over him like a cold rain. He had learned the truth, but the knowledge had come at the cost of his dignity. The world seemed to snap back into focus with a jarring suddenness. The low hum of conversation, the clinking of a spoon against a porcelain cup, the soft jazz playing from the hidden speakers, it all rushed back into his ears, but it sounded different now. It was louder, more intrusive. Every sound felt like an accusation. He was still standing, frozen in place, next to the empty booth. The velvet cushions seemed to mock him, their plushness a stark contrast to the hollowness he felt inside. His eyes were fixed on the table, on the single, crisp $100 bill lying next to the untouched glass of water. It was an island of green in a sea of white linen, a symbol of a kindness so profound it felt like a weapon. He had built a career on reading people, on understanding the unspoken rules of wealth and status, and in one fell swoop he had misread everything. The man wasn't an intruder. He was the main event. And the waiter, in his arrogance, had tried to throw him out. He felt a presence beside him, and slowly, as if moving through thick syrup, he turned his head. It was the manager. Her face was a mask of controlled fury, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Her eyes, which usually held a professional warmth, were now as cold and hard as granite. She didn't look at the other patrons, who were all trying to pretend they weren't watching the drama unfold. She only had eyes for the waiter. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her quiet, clipped tone was more terrifying than any shout could have been. "Your station is covered," she said, her voice low and sharp. "Go to the office. Wait for me there." It wasn't a request. It was a command. The waiter opened his mouth to say something, to apologize, to explain, but the words caught in his throat. What could he possibly say? There was no excuse. He gave a numb, mechanical nod and turned to walk away. Each step toward the staff area felt like a mile long. He could feel the weight of 100 stares on his back. He imagined the whispers. "That's the one. Can you believe what he did?" To him of all people. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, counting the pattern in the carpet, trying to block out the world. He caught a glimpse of his reflection in the polished brass of a service station as he passed. He saw a pale young man with wide, terrified eyes, a ghost haunting the edges of a world he no longer belonged to. He didn't recognize himself. The confident, sharp-witted waiter who had started his shift an hour ago was gone, replaced by this shell of a person, this walking monument to his own stupidity. He pushed through the swinging door that led to the kitchen, the sudden blast of heat and the clatter of pots and pans a chaotic assault on his senses. The cooks, who usually greeted him with friendly nods, looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and pity. They knew, of course they knew. News traveled fast in a restaurant. He kept his head down and walked straight to the small, cramped office in the back. Closing the door behind him and sinking into the cheap chair, he sat in the dim light, the only sound the frantic beating of his own heart. He replayed the entire evening in his mind, but this time he saw it through a new lens. He saw the man's quiet entrance, not as an intrusion, but as a moment of peace for someone who probably rarely got it. He saw his simple questions about the menu, not as a sign of ignorance but as a genuine interest, a desire to connect with the experience. And he saw his own words, his own cruel, condescending, judgmental words, and they made him feel sick to his stomach. Perhaps the cafe on the corner would be more appropriate for your budget. The phrase echoed in his mind, each word a fresh stab of shame. He had been so sure of himself, so proud of his ability to judge people. He thought he was protecting the restaurant's standards, but he was just feeding his own ego, propping up his fragile sense of self-worth by putting someone else down. He had never felt so small, so utterly worthless. The door opened and the manager stepped inside, closing it softly behind her. She didn't sit. She just stood over him, her arms crossed. "Mr. Reeves was incredibly gracious," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "He said he didn't want any formal action taken. He said it was a misunderstanding." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. But it wasn't a misunderstanding, was it? It was a failure of character. A complete and total failure. The waiter could only shake his head, his eyes fixed on his own trembling hands. I'm "I'm sorry," he finally managed to choke out. "I don't know what else to say." "There's nothing to say," she replied. "Your employment here is terminated. Effective immediately." The words hit him with the force of a physical blow. He knew it was coming, but hearing them spoken aloud still sent a shockwave through his system. "You can collect your things from the locker. I expect you to be gone in 5 minutes." She turned to leave, but then she stopped at the door and looked back at him. For a brief moment, the hard facade cracked, and he saw a flicker of something else in her eyes. Not pity, but a deep, profound disappointment. "He was here," she said softly, "to host a dinner for a dozen kids from the children's hospital. A private thing. He does it every year. He pays for everything himself. He doesn't want any press, any attention. He just wants to give them a nice night out." And with that final, devastating piece of information, she was gone. The waiter sat there for a full minute, the manager's words echoing in the silence. A children's hospital. It wasn't enough that he had insulted one of the most famous and beloved actors in the world. He had insulted a man who was using his fame and fortune to do something genuinely good, something quiet and kind without any expectation of reward. The shame was no longer just a feeling. It was a physical weight, crushing him from the inside out. He slowly stood up, his legs feeling weak and unsteady. He walked to his locker, his movements robotic. He put on his own worn jacket, a jacket that suddenly felt very similar to the one the man had been wearing. He reached into his pocket and felt the crisp, heavy paper of the $100 bill. He hadn't even realized he'd taken it. He pulled it out and stared at it. It was his severance pay, a gift from the man whose career he had just tried to ruin. He walked out of the restaurant and into the cool night air, the city lights blurring into a kaleidoscope of color. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he would never be the same. The bill in his pocket wasn't just money. It was a lesson. A painful, humiliating, and absolutely necessary lesson about kindness, about character, and about the fact that you can't tell the worth of a man by the clothes he wears. The cool night air did little to soothe the fire burning in his chest. He walked without a destination, his feet carrying him through the city's labyrinth of streets and alleyways. The world around him was a blur of neon signs and headlights, the sounds of distant sirens and late-night laughter a foreign language to his ears. He was an island of silence in a sea of noise. His hand was shoved deep into his pocket, his fingers wrapped tightly around the $100 bill. It felt less like money and more like a live coal, burning a hole in his fabric and his soul. Every few steps he would pull it out and look at it under the streetlights, the face of the statesman staring back at him with a silent, judgmental gaze. It was a testament to his failure, a permanent reminder of the moment his entire world had collapsed. He found himself on a bench in a small, deserted park, the skeletal branches of a winter tree reaching up toward the orange glow of the sky. He sat there for a long time, just staring at the bill in his hand. He thought about his life, about the carefully constructed tower of arrogance and judgment he had built. He had always been so proud of his ability to read people, to sort them into categories of worth based on their watches and their shoes. He thought it made him smart, sophisticated, one step ahead. But now he saw it for what it was, a flimsy, pathetic house of cards. And tonight, a gentle breeze had blown it all down. The man he had insulted wasn't just rich or famous. He was the kind of person who used his fortune not to buy bigger houses or faster cars, but to give a sick child a night of magic and wonder. The waiter had built his identity on a foundation of sand, and the tide had just rushed in. He thought about the grace with which the man had handled the situation. No anger, no humiliation. Just a quiet, sad look and a $100 tip. He hadn't done it to show off. He had done it because it was in his nature to be kind, even to those who didn't deserve it. The waiter felt a wave of something so intense it was almost painful. It wasn't just shame anymore. It was a profound, bone-deep regret. He wanted to go back in time, just 5 minutes, and be a different person. He wanted to be the kind of waiter who saw a tired man in a worn jacket and offered him a glass of water with a smile, who answered his questions about mushrooms with patience and enthusiasm, who made him feel welcome, no matter what he was wearing. But time couldn't be turned back. All he had was the present, and the crushing weight of his past actions. The manager's words came back to him then, echoing in the quiet of the park. A dozen kids from the children's hospital. The words struck him with a fresh wave of nausea. He hadn't just insulted a celebrity. He had insulted a man in the middle of an act of pure, selfless generosity. The image of those children, some of them maybe in wheelchairs or attached to IVs, getting dressed up for a special night out, only to have their host treated like garbage, was more than he could bear. He had been an obstacle to a moment of joy for kids who had precious little of it in their lives. The $100 bill in his hand suddenly felt dirty, tainted. It was blood money, paid for with his own dignity and the man's kindness. He couldn't keep it. Spending it on himself would be an insult to the very spirit in which it was given. A new idea began to form in his mind. Small at first, then growing with a desperate urgency. He didn't know the name of the hospital. He didn't know how to find the man to apologize. But he could do something. He could take this money, this symbol of his shame, and turn it into something good. He stood up from the bench, a new sense of purpose guiding his steps. He started walking again, this time with a destination in mind. He passed a few bars, their warm light spilling out onto the sidewalk, a temptation he easily ignored. He walked until he found what he was looking for, a 24-hour superstore, its bright, fluorescent lights a beacon in the dark night. He walked through the automatic doors, the cart's squeaky wheel echoing in the vast, empty space. He went straight to the toy aisle. The aisle was a riot of color and noise, a world of plastic and imagination that felt a million miles away from the quiet, elegant hell he had just left. He walked slowly, his eyes scanning the shelves. He wasn't just looking for toys. He was looking for a way to make things right, even in the smallest way. He thought about the kids. What would a sick child stuck in a hospital room want? He passed the loud, battery-operated gadgets and the violent action figures. He wanted something that offered a different kind of escape. He picked out a set of high-quality, colored pencils and a thick sketchbook. A child could create their own worlds with that, worlds without 4 lines and sterile white walls. He found a model car kit, a classic sports car that required patience and focus to build, a project to look forward to. He added a soft, cuddly teddy bear with kind, button eyes, a silent companion for lonely nights. And finally, he found a small, wooden puzzle of a world map, a reminder of all the places they could still go. He filled his cart with these small, thoughtful gifts, his heart aching with a strange mix of sadness and hope. At the checkout, the tired cashier barely looked up as he scanned the items. The total came to $98.50. He paid with the $100 bill, pocketed the change, and walked out with 2 heavy plastic bags. The weight of them feeling lighter than the single bill had. He didn't know which hospital it was, but he remembered the manager mentioning it was a local one. There were only a few in the area. He took a taxi to the first one, a large, imposing building that loomed in the night. The lobby was quiet and sterile, the air thick with the smell of disinfectant. He approached the information desk, where a kind-faced nurse was doing paperwork. He felt a wave of nervousness, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't want any thanks. He didn't want to explain who he was. He just wanted to leave the gifts and disappear. "Excuse me," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The nurse looked up, her expression tired but gentle. "I have some toys," he said, placing the bags on the counter. "I heard that, a gentleman was visiting some of the children here tonight. For a special dinner? I just thought these might be for them. For later." He stumbled over the words, feeling awkward and out of place. The nurse looked at the bags, then at his face, and a soft, understanding smile touched her lips. She had probably seen many acts of quiet kindness in her line of work. "That's wonderful," she said, her voice warm. "I'm sure they'll love them." "Thank you." She didn't ask his name. She didn't press for details. She just accepted the gift with a grace that reminded him of the man in the restaurant. He turned and walked away, not looking back. As he stepped out of the hospital and into the cool night air, he felt a profound sense of release. The weight on his shoulders was still there, but it was lighter now. The $100 bill was gone, but in its place was a small, quiet feeling of peace. He hadn't fixed his mistake. He hadn't erased his shame, but he had taken the first step. He had learned that true worth wasn't about the price of your suit or the size of your tip. It was about the kindness in your heart and the grace with which you treat others, especially those you can't see. He was just a man who had lost his job, a man with a long road ahead of him. But for the first time in a very long time, he felt like he was finally walking in the right direction.